So, in this PowerPoint, we're going to talk about cell communication. That's right, your cells are able to talk to one another, and they do that by sending and receiving signals. So, why do cells communicate? Cells communicate to function as a biological system, meaning a whole organism, coordinate all the cell functions, respond to the environment, maintain homeostasis. So, cell communication allows the trillions of cells in your body to function as a single organism. So, cells talk to each other so that they can coordinate their efforts to allow you to exist as a multicellular organism. So, how do cells communicate? They communicate by sending signaling molecules. So, one cell will produce a signaling molecule that'll be received by what we call the target cell. So, the signaling cell is the one that sends the molecule. The target cell is the cell that receives that signaling molecule. And these signaling molecules could be all sorts of things from proteins to lipids to even ions. So, how do cells communicate? So, cells can communicate through direct contact. So, neighboring cells right next to each other will actually reach out and touch each other. Cells can communicate over short distances. So, you'll have cells that will send out molecules, and those will reach neighboring cells nearby. And then you have long distance communication. You've probably heard this word hormone before, and this is long distance communication between cells. This is how a cell that would be in your brain could communicate with a cell that is in your foot, or a cell that's in your abdomen could communicate with a cell within your arm. So we're going to talk about some examples of cell-to-cell communication. Again, this is communication through direct contact. So in animal cells form these things called gap junctions, and we talked about this in our last unit. But gap junctions are little holes in the cell membrane that actually allow materials to directly go from the cytoplasm of one cell into the cytoplasm of another. Plant cells have a similar structure called plasmodesmata, and these are little gaps in the cell walls of plants that allow, again, items that are in the cytoplasm of the plant cell to travel from one plant cell into another, and therefore the cells can coordinate their efforts and communicate with each other. Another example of cell-to-cell communication, later in this unit, we'll talk about the immune system, and many of the immune system cells actually communicate through cell-to-cell communication. So over here is something called a T cell. Over here is something called an antigen-presenting cell. This is a white blood cell that has now engulfed a pathogen, so something that would make you sick. It is now presenting proteins on its surface that's going to activate another type of immune cell called the T cell. Short distance signaling. Again, we're going to have an entire class period dedicated to synaptic signaling, but synaptic signaling is talking about neurons, and neurons are these guys right here. This is a neuron. These are the cells that are found in your brain and in your nerves, and this is what communicates these electrical impulses from your brain to the rest of your body. So you've got the cell body here, which is the front part of our neuron. Then we have a long area here called the axon, which sends a signal along it all the way to the end, which is called the axon terminal. And axon terminal means end of the axon. And so if we look here, we're going to zoom in. Here's the axon terminal. And in the axon terminal, there are little signaling molecules called neurotransmitters. And these neurotransmitters are going to go from one nerve cell to receptor molecules on another nerve cell, or it could be from a neuron to a muscle, which could cause muscle contraction or relaxation, or a neuron and what's called an endocrine cell. Endocrine cells are the cells of your body that make hormones. Another example of short distance signaling is something called pancrean signaling. So cells release signal molecules that target nearby cells. And so examples are something called morphogens in embryonic development. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but this is how the cells of the body know how to coordinate to form all the different parts of the embryo. So how cells in the head know to become cells of the brain and of the eyes, etc., and how cells of the rump know how to form legs and everything else. Cytokines are molecules that cause what's called the inflammatory response. Those of you who have allergies are very familiar with the inflammatory response. This is what gives you those itchy eyes and the runny nose when you come into contact with an allergen. If you ever got a pinprick or an injury, you get that warm, throbby feeling at the point where the puncture was. That again is inflammatory response, and that is sent by these signaling molecules called cytokines. That's what all these little dots represent, which will stimulate your immune system to come repair that wound. Another example of short distance signaling is what's called quorum sensing. Prokaryotes talk to each other too. Even though a prokaryote is a single-celled organism, prokaryotes can actually coordinate their efforts together. That's right, the bacteria that make you sick can actually talk to each other, and they can coordinate attacks so that they can affect you more strongly. And they do this by producing a signaling molecule called autoinducer. Later in the unit, we'll spend an entire day talking about quorum sensing. But basically what happens is a bacteria sends out these little chemical molecules, these autoinducers, and when it's all by itself, it sends out the signal, but it doesn't really receive any. And maybe there's another one nearby that might pick up this lone signal. But when you have lots of bacteria, you're sending out lots of these autoinducers and they're bumping into each other. And what it'll do is when you get to a certain concentration of these signaling molecules, it will stimulate the bacteria to do a particular function. For example, make a protein that would make you sick. This was discovered in a bacteria called Vibrio fischeri. These little glowing guys right here, these are a bacteria that bioluminesce, meaning they glow. And these Vibrio fischeri live in this little guy, a type of squid. And the squid comes out at night to feed, and what would happen is the moonlight shines down and the squid at the surface would actually cast a shadow. So long time ago, this squid formed a symbiotic relationship with the bacteria. And so what happens is these little bacteria live in the skin of the squid, and at night the bacteria glow. And then when it becomes daylight, when the squid wants to hide and not glow, it spits out almost all of the bacteria. And when it does that, there's no more autoinducers to induce the bacteria to glow. And so the lights turn off. Then during the day, as the bacteria grow and replenish themselves in number, and we get a higher and higher concentration of this autoinducer, the bacteria are induced to start glowing again, and at night we have our glowing squid. Long distance signaling. So this is probably the one you're most familiar with, but didn't realize it. Long distance signaling are our hormones. So when you talk about the hormones are raging, this is actually long distance signaling, and we have many, many types of hormones in our body. And we refer to this as endocrine signaling. Endocrine is referring to the set of glands that actually produce the hormones. So endocrine system is a system of ductless glands, meaning ductless means that they're not gathering the hormone, but yet secreting them out into the blood. So secrete chemical signals directly into the blood that travel long distances to target cells. And so you can have a hormone that is produced in one part of the body affect cells throughout the rest of the entire body. So some examples of endocrine glands: the pituitary gland, the thyroid, the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland, by the way, is where we get the ADH that controls whether or not the collecting duct of the nephron is going to keep water or to let water go into the filtrate. Pancreas, ovaries, uterus, testes, all of these things are going to create molecules that can travel long distances throughout the body to communicate with one another. So there are classes of hormones. One group of hormones are called the protein-based hormones. So examples of that, protein-based hormones, we have ones that are polypeptides, so very small proteins, things like insulin and our friend ADH, antidiuretic hormone. Glycoproteins, so large proteins that have carbohydrates attached to them. These are things like follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, and luteinizing hormone, LH, which are very essential in the menstrual cycle. And then amines, so modified amino acids. So individual amino acids can actually act as hormones and signaling molecules. Things like epinephrine, also known as adrenaline, melatonin, which is important in regulating sleep cycles, and TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone, which will cause the thyroid to produce other hormones. And then the other class of hormone is lipid-based hormone. These are things that are going to be made from sterols. So a type of lipid called sterol, which is a modified cholesterol. So examples of this are sex hormones like estrogen and testosterone, or aldosterone. So how do hormones act on target cells? Remember, target cells are the cells that actually receive the signaling molecule. So the hormone would be the signaling molecule, which would be sent from one part of the body, and then the target cell is going to be the cell that actually receives that hormone. And the way protein-based hormones work is that proteins, for the most part, are hydrophilic and not lipid soluble, meaning they're not able to cross the cell membrane. And therefore, in order to send the signal, protein-based hormones have to bind to a receptor protein in the cell membrane. So if we look down here, we can see reception of that signaling molecule. So here's our protein hormone, and here's the receptor protein that's on the surface of our cell. And then what happens is when the signaling molecule attaches to this protein on the surface, it activates a series of internal proteins, which is known as a transduction pathway. Think of it as a game of telephone. So the message gets sent to the initial receptor. The receptor then activates the rest of these proteins that eventually activate or cause an internal cellular response. It'll cause the cell to do something, such as activate some enzymes, or uptake or secrete molecules, or activate a gene. So that's the response there. So action of protein hormones, so we're going to look at this generically. Here is our target cell, so this represents our target cell here. Here's the plasma membrane, so the cell membrane, the cytoplasm of the cell, and then here's our receptor protein that is stuck in that membrane, and here's the protein hormone. So this would have come from somewhere else in the body, and now this protein hormone has attached itself to a receptor. And so that is our first step, which is signaling or reception of a signal. So the signaling molecule binds to the receptor, and then it's going to activate cytoplasmic signals. It's going to actually activate a series of proteins within the cytoplasm. So this is a molecule called GTP. We'll talk about it a little bit later, but basically GTP is the exact same thing as ATP. So remember, ATP is adenosine triphosphate. GTP, same thing, but instead of adenine as the nitrogenous base, it's guanine. So we're just going to actually transfer a phosphate group from GTP, which activates this protein. And don't worry about names of proteins. All you really need to know is a molecule is received by a receptor, which then activates a series of proteins within the cell, which activates an enzyme, which activates an ATP, which is going to activate another enzyme, which activates another enzyme, so on and so forth. And we refer to this as a signal transduction. Then the signal transduction will eventually produce an action within the cell, which we call the response. And so together we call this signal, the transduction, and the response a signal transduction pathway. So a specific example of a protein signaling is the action of epinephrine, also known as adrenaline. So The target cell in this case is going to be the liver, the cytoplasm of the liver cell, the receptor protein in the membrane. And so the signaling molecule, epinephrine, comes from the adrenal gland, this little gland that sits above the kidney. And epinephrine will be received by the receptor. This is our signal. It's going to activate GTP to activate a series of proteins within the cell. So again, the names aren't important. What you need to realize is that the series of steps are the same. Basically, what's happening is the reception of the signal is activating a series of proteins within the cell, which we call transduction. So this activation of a series of proteins within the cell is transduction, which finally leads to a response. And in this case, the response is it's going to cause the polysaccharide glycogen to be broken into glucose. And then this glucose will be released into the bloodstream. So that's a response. So the signaling molecule is epinephrine, received on the surface of the cell because it's a protein-based hormone. This reception of the signal is going to activate a signal transduction pathway, which is just simply the activation of multiple proteins and enzymes within the cell, which eventually leads to our response, which is going to be the digestion of glycogen into glucose and the glucose released into the blood. So, second messenger system is referring to the fact that we can have multiple activations of multiple transduction pathways within a single cell. And what this does is it amplifies our signal, meaning makes our signal stronger. And therefore, we can have the response happen faster and have the response happen with more vigor. So what's happening here is one protein actually activates a series of proteins, which activates another series of proteins, which activates another series, so on and so forth, so that we get a big amplification of the signal. And we call this a cascade multiplier. Cascade meaning an activation of a series of events. And this will help lead to a faster response by the cell. In contrast, how do lipid hormones act on target cells? So lipid-based hormones, what's different about them is because they're lipid-based, they can go directly through the cell membrane. They don't have to be received on the surface because lipid-based hormones are hydrophobic. So they're lipid soluble and they can diffuse straight across the cell membrane and enter the cell directly. And therefore, they don't bind to a receptor on the surface of the cell, they bind to receptors in the cytoplasm or the nucleus of the cell. And in some cases, the hormone will bind directly to the DNA and act as something called a transcription factor, meaning something that's going to activate the copying of DNA to RNA so that we can make a new protein. And we call this turning on genes, the activation of transcription. So let's take a look at how that works. So here's the bloodstream here. Here's a steroid hormone, meaning our lipid-based hormone. Here's our target cell, the plasma membrane, and our cytoplasm. And because the hormone, the steroid hormone, is lipid-based, it goes directly through the cell membrane, and it's going to dock on a receptor protein inside the cytoplasm as opposed to within the membrane. So our hormone crosses the cell membrane. It's going to bind to a receptor protein, and this receptor protein is going to actually activate the transcription of a gene, meaning copying DNA into RNA. So that's this molecule here. So we're going to make RNA. RNA is going to leave our cell and go to our friend the ribosome. And the ribosome is going to read that RNA, create a protein, and then that protein will be secreted from the cell. So the big difference here with a lipid-based hormone is that the signaling molecule can go directly into the cytoplasm and act as a signaling molecule within the cell, as opposed to having to dock on the surface like a protein hormone and then set off a signal transduction. So examples of responses to cell signals. So the main thing that happens when a cell signal docks on a cell or activates a receptor molecule within the cell is activation of gene expression. And what gene expression is the activation of copying DNA into RNA. So these signaling molecules tell a cell when to actually copy part of their DNA into RNA, and then that RNA will eventually lead to the production of a protein. So this is what actually tells our endomembrane system to start making a protein. Okay, so again, the signaling molecule will actually tell the cell when to take a portion of its DNA, copy it to RNA for the purpose of making a protein. Another example of a cell response is DNA replication and cell division. So these signaling molecules can actually stimulate the cell to copy its DNA and then for the cell to divide to make new cells. So cell division there. And then apoptosis. Another thing that can happen is signaling molecules can actually tell the cell to self-destruct. So for example, if something goes wrong with our cell, the cell becomes cancerous, the cell is not functioning properly, other cells neighboring it can actually send signals to our defective cell to cause it to do apoptosis, to self-destruct. So we'll talk a lot more in the coming lessons about each of these examples of cell signaling that we talked about, as well as doing biotheater, and we'll also discuss some of the responses of cells to cell communication. Hope this was helpful.